Welcome to Peter and Phil's Courageous Conversations, a podcast addressing race relations and social issues in hopes that you'll be inspired to do the same. Now, let's begin our conversation with your hosts, Dr. Peter Weinstein and Dr. Phillip Nelson.
Welcome back to Courageous Conversations. I'm Dr. Peter Weinstein. I'm here with Dr. Phillip Nelson, and we are continuing our conversation with Stacey Pursell. Thanks to the support of Nationwide, thanks to the support of Nicole. We're going to kind of pick up where we left off, but I'm going to try to bring together a lot of my thoughts in one question, and I'm looking forward to seeing how this gets answered. Now, we were talking about in our last episode emotional intelligence, basically the ability to use and manage emotions and understand the emotions of others. Stacy, you work exclusively now in the veterinary field. As somebody who works with veterinarians who are currently in practice and somebody who works with veterinarians looking for positions either as students or as recent grads or even experienced veterinarians, can you give me your thoughts on how emotionally intelligent most veterinarians are when it comes down to understanding the profession? And so basically, how strong is the EQ of many of the veterinarians with whom you communicate?
Well, I would say that, it really comes down to the individual because I interact with so many different types of veterinarians in terms of some that are in school or just are about to become a veterinarian to just graduated to people that are 5 or 10 years out to people that are 30 years out, so it's really comes down to the individual. But I wanted to say something that ties into emotional intelligence, and that's feedback. And feedback is a gift. And I think this is something that Rob Best and I were talking about when he was on my podcast and we were talking about emotional intelligence. But I read a book years ago, and it's a very thick book. It's called The Success Principles, and it's by Jack Canfield. And in that book, he talks about feedback being a gift. And I noticed this in my work, like the candidate I just mentioned that wore my hiring manager out because he talked too much. There have been times over the years where a candidate has done something in an interview. I had a candidate that went to 3 job interviews, and in all 3, we got the feedback that he talked too much and that he didn't listen. And in all 3 instances, I gave him that feedback. So the first time it happened, I sent him in it was an executive candidate for interviewing for an animal health company. So the first interview, he was interviewing for a VP position. The hiring manager said he talks too much, he wasn't listening. I gave him that feedback. The second interview, he did the same thing. I did it at a third interview with a different company. And when I gave him the feedback, his answer was, well, none of those were the right fit for me. So instead of receiving feedback as a gift and listening to, if it happens 3 times, it's him, it's not it's not the hiring manager. And he got so defensive. I would say that what ties into emotional intelligence is not only the ability to regulate your emotions, but people don't usually give feedback unless they care about you and they're trying to help you. So in that instance, when I give candidates feedback, like don't talk so much in the interview or listen more, make sure that you're prepared or show up on time or whatever the feedback is, people need to be more receptive to listening. Rob Best said all feedback is true. And at first, when he said that, I had to think about that for a minute and go, is all feedback true? But his response is, for that person, it's true. Like that was that person's interpretation of the situation. So for veterinarians, one of the best things they can do early in their career is to be open to feedback and to receive it as it's a gift because this person is trying to help you. Don't get defensive. And I know it can hurt people's feelings and things, but it's how you grow. We all have blind spots, and other people can see things in our blind spots that we can't see ourselves. And when they give us that feedback, everybody ought to listen to that and go, well, maybe that's an area that I can improve on. And that ties back to emotional intelligence, just being self-aware. People like to be around people that relieve pressure. People don't like to be around people that cause pressure or drama. So in whatever, this is advice to anybody out there that's listening, in whatever situation you're in interacting with somebody, try to relieve pressure and not cause drama or stress versus, be the person that's a pressure valve and relieves pressure and doesn't cause drama, because those are the types of people that all of us want to be around. So if you're somebody causing drama or adding pressure, that's a person that needs to work on their emotional intelligence and how they're impacting other people, because we want to be positive impacts on other people, not impact them negatively. I love it. Everybody needs to read that book.
Absolutely. Were you a member of Vet Partners when we had Jack come and speak to the group about?
No,
Yeah, so we actually, I was president that year. We had Jack Canfield come to speak at Vet Partners a number of years ago when
I
I think,
didn't know that. That's awesome.
yes.
I wish
So
I had been involved in. What year was that?
2007, I believe, many years ago when I was president in the dark ages when we barely had electricity. Phil remembers.
The first meeting I went to was when it was in San Antonio. What was that, 15 years ago?
Got me. I'm too old to remember these things. So, Phil, the reason I asked Stacy the question about EQ and veterinary students is because I'm of the impression, and as a former dean and consultant to the deans out there, I'm of the impression that we should be looking and trying to have a greater measure of EQ in our veterinary students to parallel with the high levels of IQ that they already have. Your thought?
Don't think that we haven't addressed that. And I'm sure that the way we're addressing it is as embryonic as the idea of EQ is itself. And so I'm not trying to overstate the impact, but veterinary education has recognized the importance of emotional intelligence and has been reacting to that recognition for at least a decade. And we actually have instruments that essentially provide feedback. The importance of EQ is first to recognize that there is such a thing, and secondly, where do you stand? Where is your stage of development in that area? Especially when parents don't necessarily direct their training in that area. They do it naturally, or they don't, or not. And so every student is at a different point in that gradient, and we recognize that. On the other hand, and as a matter of fact, at Western U, which is which is one of three schools I can speak of, and the most recent, the basis for the small group learning that occurs at Western U in their problem-based curriculum is so that we can allow the development of self-awareness in that area. We purposefully put students in small groups to learn how to work in a group and to work with, and then we purposefully change those groups up at certain intervals throughout the year to force a student to learn to work with every other classmate that otherwise they could avoid in a lecture format. That was the premise behind that, is to develop their emotional intelligence. Now, what happens is something that is similar to the analogy that Stacy related to us. If a student happens to be a student that talks too much, or a student that's overly aggressive, that's the student that usually the facilitator has to work with. And in the first group, it may be a horrible experience. And then when that student moves to the second group, that experience may be just slightly less horrible. And then when that student moves to the third group, a little less horrible. But by the time the student gets to the third group, when the student realizes that every group he or she has been in has been horrible, and everybody else has had a great experience, that's when they begin to question themselves. That's when they begin to realize, with the help of facilitators, maybe it's me. Maybe it's something I'm doing, because I'm not describing the same experiences my classmates are describing in this curriculum.
I would say that being able to work with people is the number one skill that's needed, really, in almost every walk of life, but including in the veterinary profession, because veterinarians work with people, and especially if they're working in general practice, and they have coworkers and they have supervisors, and they're dealing with people all day long. So those soft skills, those communication skills, are the most important skill that people can learn and improve and get better at.
I totally
And
agree. As a matter of fact, when I am introduced to new applicants who want to come to vet med, It is such a common feeling among people who aspire to be veterinarians to express a loathing of human beings. They say, I love animals. I don't like human beings. And I have to say, if that's your problem, don't come into vet med, because I've never seen a horse bring itself to the clinic.
That's right.
I've never seen a dog bring itself to the clinic. I've never seen a veterinarian give a prescription to the cat,
It's so funny because this loathing of human beings that you brought up goes way back to our original conversation about civility.
Yes.
That we started in the prior episode from that standpoint. So maybe veterinarians are the cause for all of the incivility. This is a joke, listeners, okay? Deal with my skepticism, cynicism, and sense of humor. But maybe veterinarians are the cause for all our incivility. I agree with you 100% on communication and teamwork. And the 5 elements of great emotional intelligence are self-awareness. So that individual who was not able to reel himself in had no self-awareness, self-regulation, motivation he probably had, empathy he may have, he probably was a little bit lacking in social skills. So it's really understanding these. But I want to address something, Phil. PBL is great. I think it's wonderful. And I think every vet student who comes out of Western, and I have a slight bias because I teach there, but every vet student who comes out of Western is better prepared from a communication standpoint than most other veterinary schools. Totally agree. But what I'm interested in is how can we better assess emotional intelligence during the application period before they get into veterinary school, so they go into veterinary school already with some of the people skills, and then we can focus on the clinical skills to add to the people skills, because it's much harder to develop people skills when you get into your 20s. How important do you think is EQ versus IQ when it comes down to placing somebody in a job?
I think it's equally important. Don't get me, all right. I know people want to pick one over the other. And I think that in certain circumstances that matters. For instance, when you're meeting a new client, EQ is probably more important, right? But when you're at the surgery table, IQ is important, and TQ, technical skills, are important. So as far as the mosaic is concerned, I think they're equally important. But the problem has been we haven't recognized EQ as for any importance, and now there are people who want to overemphasize it. And as far as learning how to assess and discriminate applicants when they come here, I'd rather focus on the preparation of those applicants in EQ at the college and high school level or at the parental level, rather than come up with all of these discriminating instruments that might lead us to overemphasizing one or the other. We're not producing widgets in education. We're developing human beings, and we're developing human beings from a diverse society. And one instrument that might pick up high EQ has the potential of discriminating against those who have low EQ, but could become one of the best veterinarians we've ever had if we provide sufficient training. So I know I haven't answered your question directly, but it's because I think that it's a value of balance when we look at our applicants.
I was going to say that in an interview situation, it's not always the smartest person that gets hired or the person with the most skills that gets hired. It's whoever interviews the best.
Yes.
And I was working on a search for a pharmaceutical company who was hiring a professional services veterinarian and had multiple candidates that had tremendous experience working for other pharmaceutical companies. The person that was hired was the least experienced person, which kind of surprised me because this person didn't have the experience all the other candidates had. And when I asked my client, he said, this person interviewed the best, that the communication skills just knocked all the other candidates out of consideration. And, in a veterinary hospital, when you have your client in there with their pet, they don't know who has the most degrees or who has the most experience or who's the smartest one in the room. It's whoever can communicate with them the best and explain to them what's going on with their pet and what to do about it. That's the person that they're going to connect with. The smartest person could be there, but if they can't communicate with the client's not going to have a good experience. So it all comes down to the communication skills and how the other person received what just happened.
Sometimes the smartest person is kept in the back
for a reason.
For a reason, and
So,
used as the resource that they're best used for.
Correct. And so, using your example, Phil, to get to the surgery table, you have to go through the client. So it's the EQ that actually allows you to use your IQ in many cases. And I think that there's been a bit more of a shift as veterinary medicine has moved more and more into a service industry, and the need to be able to support the emotional intelligence, the emotions of our clients and our team, to a need to have a much greater balance of EQ and IQ. I think maybe in our generation, IQ was paramount because we were really just becoming recognized and appreciated for everything that we were doing in the veterinary field. But as we've become more of a service-based industry in meeting the needs of the consumer and the ability for consumers to spend, I think there has become almost a need for an equivalency of EQ and IQ, because if you can't communicate to the client, you can't build the trust necessary to deliver the knowledge that you have accumulated.
Well, I think that's where self-awareness comes in as well. And so I have no problems with your rule, although I do know many exceptions in that, I've had cases referred where regardless of my EQ, when I walked into the room, I wasn't necessarily accepted because of the color of my skin. But I had been referred so fluently by the referring veterinarian that they were willing to overcome that in order to have a person with IQ address their dog. And I think that when people if they're self-aware and realize that they have problems communicating with a certain class of people or whatever, that's when they use their system to protect themselves. That's when they allow the vet tech to take over, or that's when they allow their communicator to take over, just so that they can provide the services that they need. Either way, EQ allows IQ to practice.
So, Stacy, we've dominated a lot of the conversation and the questions. You've listened to some of our podcasts. We've known each other for a while. You've known Phil for a little while. Were there some thoughts, issues, topics that you wanted to address in this conversation? You're usually asking the questions by hosting your own podcast. It puts you in a little bit different light when you're the one answering the questions. So you want to throw some questions back at us and feel like you're running the podcast? We'll give you that for 30 seconds.
I don't know that I have a question, but I have more of a comment. I just think that the world in general, there needs to be more grace, more manners. Just the word grace that comes to mind with all the things we're talking about. It makes me sad just how polarizing the world is, and people just like we talked about with the presidential debate and just how people treat each other. I mean, I think just we could all be more graceful and courteous, having more courtesy. I'll tell a quick story. My husband and I were in Fort Worth for the Southwest Vet Symposium a couple weeks ago. And after it was all over, we went into this coffee shop and we stood there I almost wanted to get a timer to see how long do we stand here, but we stood there for over 5 minutes at the counter, and the two ladies behind the counter were just talking with each other, and neither one of them ever looked up to see if there was anybody standing there. Afterwards, my husband said, I think that maybe they're trying to see how long we can stand here without saying hello. And then maybe they're seeing how long we're going to, So anyway, I finally said, are you all open? And she said, yes, we're open. So I said, can I order? And then I ordered something, and she goes, well, we've already cleaned. They were closing in 45 minutes. And she goes, we've cleaned all of our machines. So we can't fill your order today. And I said, okay, thanks. And we left. I told my husband, I said, why are they not even open? They weren't open. Like, why did the sign say open? So even in customer service situations, you've probably gone into stores where you looked for somebody to help you and there was nobody in sight, just customer service needs to be improved. Just respect, politeness, manners, grace. We just need all of those to be elevated.
So I'm
Yeah,
sitting here
that sounds.
smiling. I'm sitting here smiling because Phil ran restaurants when he was growing up, and his dad's in the food service industry. And it's like, so Phil, Stacy walks in. It's 45 minutes before closing time. Nobody's been in for a couple hours. How would you have handled that?
I would have lost my EQ and fired both of them very quickly because first of all, they closed an hour before they were supposed to close. That's the first problem. So they clearly don't care about revenue or the money that's paying their check. Secondly, they don't care about the customer. And now that may be a problem with our training, but I would wonder, and I'd be very disappointed if one of them was the manager, and not just the person with the keys, because then I have a more systemic problem
There's an interesting example of that we see sometimes in veterinary medicine where the business is supposed to be open until 6, but they don't take appointments after 5:30. And a
Yes.
client calls and
Yes,
wants to
yes,
be seen.
or even walk-ins.
Yes. So this is the dilemma of balancing a service industry and a healthcare industry, because maybe it would be better actually for that pet to go to an emergency clinic, depending upon what the reason is. But at the same time, you're trying to build a relationship from a long-term standpoint.
Yeah, I've
And I
heard
had a
stories
similar-
like that. Go ahead, Phil.
I had a similar experience, Stacy, but for different reasons. I went to a fast food restaurant. I won't name it, but because I love this particular product. But they have so many choices that are so complicated in producing the final sandwich or product that they can't keep up, and they're short of labor. And so when I walk in, I stood for 5 minutes watching a high school student lackadaisically moving from point to point, dealing with call-ins and everything else. And I quickly realized there's not enough people here to even greet the people who walked in. Now, it wasn't that they were ignoring me. They were truly busy. But with the complicated menu and the lack of numbers, it resulted in a intolerable delay in just being greeted, let alone having your order taken.
Staffing issues are the biggest challenge that when I talk to companies, that's the biggest challenge most of them have. My middle son, who's 19, when he was 17 or 18, he and his friend who was 16 at the time were working in a fast food restaurant, and the two of them were in there and the manager was in there, and they said the manager went to so my son was running the counter, his friend was running the drive-through, the manager was cooking the food. The manager went into the office, took a phone call, left the restaurant crying.
No.
Left my son and his friend running this whole fast food establishment by themselves. My son and his friend had never cooked the food before. They always worked the drive-through or the counter. So they were there trying to figure out how to cook the food, how to run the drive-through, how to run the counter. When the store closed, they had to call the general manager because they didn't have a key. They didn't know how to lock it up or what to do with the money or to shut it down.
Yeah.
Staffing challenges.
Which is a great sequelae to, I have two topics I want to cover as we try to wrap things up. One is veterinary workforce issues. We're all over the place in this profession about need. You're in the trenches in many ways, dealing with practices that are looking for clinicians, managers, et cetera. Do you perceive that the workforce issues are changing in any way, shape, or form? Are they getting better? Is there supply and demand slowing down? I mean, COVID was a real disruptor from that standpoint. But what's your take on the veterinary workforce issue?
There's still a shortage. I first noticed the shortage back in 2008 during the Great Recession, when I was hearing at the time that there were too many veterinarians in the marketplace. I was seeing a shortage because my phone was ringing with clinics trying to find veterinarians. And, we had all these jobs posted on our website, and I was getting calls from so many different industries, like the aviation, the automotive, construction industry, from recruiters saying, what's happening in the veterinary space? Why are all these jobs? We don't have any jobs open in our space. And then in the last number of years, my phone rings off the hook on a daily basis with practices needing to hire doctors and to find people for industry. I did notice on the AVMA job board last year around this time, there were about 1,000 more openings in the last time I checked this year. So it looks like there's from what I saw the last time, there were less jobs posted, but I still believe there's very much a shortage of veterinarians and other professionals in the space because I see it firsthand in the conversations that I have all day long with employers that are trying to hire and they can't find people.
And does this shortage, does your view of the shortage cover the stratification of veterinarians, meaning from entry-level veterinarians to owners?
Well, all levels of veterinarians, I'm talking about from the employee standpoint, not so much the owners, but employers that are trying to hire associate veterinarians or medical directors or ER, urgent care specialists. And I don't see that shortage going away anytime soon.
Okay.
I think it's going to continue over the next decade.
So, Peter, if you don't mind, I have two follow-up questions, but Peter had one other issue. So you can only take one of them in order to give Peter a fair space. But I'm going to mention them anyway so you can be thinking about it, the other one. The first is that if that's the case, what do you think about the new schools that are on the drawing boards? There are as many as 10 new schools that are on the drawing board, maybe as many as 15 if you take into account non-U.S. schools. And the second is, what do you think, and do you think the mid-level veterinary practitioner will affect that shortage in any redeemable way? You can take any one of those you want.
So the first question was about the schools and what do I think as far as its impact on the shortage?
Yes.
So I think that it's a positive thing that more schools are going to open. I don't think that with the graduates of those schools that are opening, that it's still going to be enough to solve the shortage.
Okay.
You can
Peter,
address
something else.
You can address the second one as well, because my next topic has nothing to do with the veterinary field.
So the next topic was about the mid-level practitioner idea. Are you aware of that?
Yes.
Okay. So,
yes.
And you know that Colorado State has actually created a degree in that area. So what do you think about that?
Lincoln Memorial as well.
Yeah. Well, it's a controversial thing. I know there's people in the space that are for it and against it. When I go to the dentist, I see the hygienist for 55 minutes. I see the dentist for 5 minutes. They get a lot of people in and out. When I go to a lot of, not necessarily my primary physician, but if I go to an urgent care facility or something after hours, most of the time I don't see an MD or a DO. I'll see the nurse practitioner. I would say when that first happened, I didn't love the idea of not seeing a physician, but over time it's something I've gotten used to, and that they seem very competent, when I go. And it's a controversial idea. I know some people are for it, some people are against it. I think that there is it's a hard question to answer because it hasn't been done in the vet space. So I can understand, both sides of the argument, but I think it's complicated because you've got different levels of veterinary technicians, you've got LVTs, you've got RVTs, so I would just say it's complicated.
Well, that was smart.
Right, so I want to tie up some loose ends as we wrap up, and it may be an uncomfortable question, but this is Courageous Conversations. At the very beginning, we were talking about civility and values, and you happen to live in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which is the source and the site for one of the most significant race massacres in American history. How have you been to the Tulsa Historical Society Museum? Have you looked into what the whole Tulsa race massacre and if you want to talk about wrapping things into an area of incivility, does Tulsa talk about it, or is it just kind of a secret?
Say it's talked about. I didn't grow up in Tulsa. I grew up in Houston, but I've lived here since I was in high school. So I would say that it's pretty well talked about. What's really great about Tulsa is there is a park that was built a few years ago called the Gathering Place, there's a billionaire that lives in Tulsa, George Kaiser, and he largely funded this gathering place as a way to bring everybody together. to be able to gather at this amazing park. Go look on YouTube, this park called the Gathering Place. It's one of the most beautiful parks in the world. It's huge. There's so much to do there. And that was built as a way to bring all Tulsans together to, unite. And I think that that's a great thing.
Well, and it actually ties things up beautifully because it's an area of great civility, is it not?
Absolutely.
Bill, back to you.
No, I was enjoying watching and listening to you all.
I think that's a good place to wrap things up, though, isn't it? I mean, it kind of ties everything up.
Absolutely. So, Stacy, we want to thank you for spending the time with us. Thank you for your eloquence. Thank you for your intellectual approach to our questions. Thank you for putting up with us, particularly, in terms of our idiosyncrasies and in trying to promote courageous conversations, real conversations. The audience should know that we didn't give you pre-questions for this conversations. I don't think no one knew where we were going to go with this other than, and we tried to follow a natural stream of order and of ideas. I shouldn't say order, a disorder, in order to promote an intellectual inquisition, if you will, of the topics, not the people. And so to our audience, if we were able to provoke or invoke any new thoughts or approaches, then we did our job. If we weren't, I guess we failed. But it wasn't Stacy's fault that happened. Stacy, thank you so much for agreeing to come. And we're going to give you a chance to say one more thing, to give us your last word before we sign off.
Yes, thank you both for having me here. I really enjoyed our conversation. And Peter, I look forward to you being on my podcast in January.
Looking forward to it as well. Phil, it's time to bring it home. You know what time it is, Phil?
Peanut butter for you. I'm going to I made a garbage omelet yesterday that I think I'm going to finish off today. But I'm looking forward to that. Stacy, the best to you and your family. And
thank
to
you
our
so
listeners,
much.
and to Nationwide and Nicole, thank you all so much for all of your support.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for another courageous conversation. Be sure to follow us and check back next week for more.